Welcome back to Rockford Reading Daily. We are continuing to read Evicted by Matthew Desmond. We are beginning part 2, which is entitled Out, and we are starting chapter 9, which is entitled Order Some Carryout. Lorraine was up before the sun, dashing cool water on her face. She usually rose before dawn, feeling her best in the morning. The day after her brush with Tobin was different. She had stayed in bed, trying to ignore the situation by burrowing under the covers. She only got up to let Digger out, looking through the curtains and the blinds for Tobin or Lenny before stepping out the door with the leash. Digger was her brother Beaker's dog, a small black mutt. Lorraine had agreed to watch him while Beaker was in the hospital for his hurt. Lorraine's trailer was spotless and uncluttered. When a visitor would comment on its cleanliness, she would smile and credit her handheld steamer or share tips like slipping in an aspirin when washing whites. She had lived in her trailer for about a year and had come to like it, especially in the morning, before the gossips began congregating outside. She now had everything just so. She had found white serving utensils to match the white cupboards in the kitchen and a small desk for her old computer. None of this made paying Tobin 77% of her income any easier. The sun lifted higher and the trailer park began to stir with the sounds of children and car engines. Lorraine studied her phone. She knew that there were two main programs in Milwaukee for people facing eviction. The first was emergency assistance for families at risk of, quote, impending homelessness, end quote. You could apply for these funds once every year if you were a U.S. citizen in possession of an eviction notice at or below 115% of the poverty level and could prove with divorce papers, a crime report, a pink slip, or some other documentation that you had experienced a sudden loss of income. But to qualify, you also had to have dependent children in your home, so emergency assistance was out. The second program was the Homeless Prevention Program, offered through community advocates and mainly federally funded. But to qualify for that benefit, you not only had to have experienced the loss of income, you also had to demonstrate that your current income could cover future rents. Plus, you needed landlord buy-in, which Lorraine didn't have. Like emergency assistance, this service was reserved more for the unlucky, those who have been laid off or mugged, than the chronically rent burdened. Community Advocates was able to offer this benefit to only 950 families each year. It took Milwaukee less than 6 weeks to evict that many families. Lorraine dialed a number by heart. Quote, yes, I was wondering. I was told that you help people with their rent? Oh. Oh no? Okay. End quote. She hung up. Lorraine dialed the Social Development Commission, an anti-poverty organization. They couldn't help. Someone had told her that the YMCA on 27th made emergency loans. She called them. Quote, yes, I was instructed to call you because I was told you could help me with my rent. My rent. Rent. R-E-N-T. End quote. Nothing. Lorraine did not dial the number on a tenants union because Milwaukee, like most American cities, didn't have one. By mid-morning, Lorraine had dialed all the nonprofit, city, and state agencies she could think of. None came through. On a lark, she dialed one more number. She lifted the phone and heard the indifferent throb through the speaker. Lorraine shrugged. The line to Marsha P. Coggs Human Services Center, the, quote, welfare building, end quote, was always busy. The mover started the trucks early in the morning, diesel engines grumbling as the men gathered with cigarettes and mugs of black coffee. The city was soggy from previous night's rain. Some of the men were young and athletic with pierced ears. Others were barrel-chested and middle-aged, slapping their leather gloves on their jeans. The oldest among them was Tim, lean and sour-faced with reddish-brown skin, stubble, and a fresh pack of Salem's in his front pocket. Almost all of the men were black and wore boots and work jackets with the name of their company, Eagle Moving and Storage, and various clever slogans. Quote, movings for the birds, end quote. Quote, service with the grunt, end quote. Quote, order some carryout, end quote. The Brattain brothers, Tom, Dave, and Jim, had taken over the company from their father. When he had started it back in 1958, there were only 1 or 2 eviction moves a week. He ran a 2-truck operation out of his home and would pick up men from the rescue mission when he needed an extra hand. 50 years later, The company employed 35 people, most of them full-time movers, owned a fleet of vans and 18-foot trucks, and operated out of a 3-story, 108,000 square foot building that had originally held a furniture factory. 40% of their business came from eviction moves. Eagle's moving crew worked with 2 sheriff deputies. The deputies would knock on the door to announce the eviction. The movers would follow, clearing out the home. Landlords footed the bill. Before a landlord could activate the sheriff's office, he had to contract with the bonded moving company. There were 4 such companies in Milwaukee, Eagle being the largest. To hire one of Eagle's 5-man crews, a landlord had to put down a $350 deposit, the average cost of an eviction job. Eagle then handed over a letter of authority, which the landlord would take to the sheriff's office, along with the necessary court documents and an additional $130 sheriff's fee. The sheriff had 10 days to remove the tenants. A formal eviction that involved sheriffs and movers could run around $600 when you include the court filing charges and process serving fees. Court filing charges and process service fees, Landlords could add these costs to a judgment, but often never got them back. Okay, let's have a small reflection. So we see here that there is a business model that has been formed off of these evictions. And we see here how many people have profited off of these people evictions. And again, that is one of the things I think is the most important to point out in a capitalistic society, is that it can only function through exploitation, that you can only gain from someone else's having some type of a loss or someone else being shorted in some type of a way. And so to see that the sheriff's law enforcement makes money off of these evictions, essentially just by being present, showing up there, they get a $120 fee. And we've already read about the exuberant amount of evictions that take place. And I'm sure in different cities, different counties, not cities, but different counties, because sheriffs are connected to counties and not cities. Police departments are cities, sheriff departments or whatever are county. And so depending on the county, I'm sure that price is higher or lower. So we see that the sheriffs and the institution of policing makes money off of these evictions. We see that these movers are making money off of these evictions, and the landlords, they may not get a financial gain immediately, but we've seen based off how Shireen, I don't want to mispronounce her name, but we've seen from the previous readings that the landlords file paperwork to try to make more money off of these evictions, and most of them have somebody lined up to come into the house so that way they can be getting last month's rent and deposit from whoever moves in next. And so we see how all of these different entities are benefiting in some type of a way from this eviction. And this eviction is not this small loss for a family. It is a humongous loss for an individual or for a family to go from having a roof over their head to not having one. And we see how few resources are in existence for people to be able to combat this. And so those are all the things that stand out to me. And one of the things I think is important about reading these things is what I want to say is lost train of thought there for a second. But what is important is that as we're reading these books, we're not just arbitrarily reading them to read them. That's why I take these breaks in between to try to expound upon some of the information that we've gained and to put it in a different perspective or give it a different vantage point, or to explain how it connects to other issues that we've read about. But also, as we're reading this, we need to be trying to figure out and formulate what needs exist in our society, for what organizations are needed in our society, what institutions, what type of individuals, what type of ideologies are needed in our society to combat some of these social injustice issues. Okay, let's find where I stopped at. Okay. Dave Brittain, a white man with graying hair and a long stride, gave the men the signal, and they climbed into the trucks. Tim drove the van, and when Dave went out on moves, he sat in the passenger seat. The daily evictions route began with the northernmost address and pushed south. Eagle's truck would lumber through the Northside ghetto in the morning and early afternoon. Then they would cross the Menominee River Valley and course through the predominantly Hispanic streets of the near South Side before ending their day in the trailer parks on the white far South Side. The sheriffs met the moving crew outside an apartment complex on Silver Spring Drive. John, the older of the two deputies and the one who most looked the part, broad shoulders, thick jowls, sunglasses, cop mustache, gum, gave the door a knock. A small black woman answered, rubbing the sleep out of her eyes. When John looked around and saw a tidy house with dishes drying in a rack and not a box packed, he turned to his partner and asked, quote, "Are we in the right house?" End quote. He placed the call back to the office. When Sheriff John walked into a house and saw mattresses on the floor, grease on the ceiling, cockroaches on the walls, and clothes, hair extensions, and toys scattered about, he didn't double check. Sometimes tenants had already abandoned the place, leaving behind dead animals and rotting food. Sometimes the movers puked. Quote, "The first rule of evictions," end quote, Sheriff John liked to say, quote, "is never open the fridge," end quote. When things were especially bad, when an apartment was covered in trash or dog shit, or when one of the guys would find a needle, Dave would nod and say, quote, "Junk in," end quote, leaving the mess for the landlord. John hung up the phone and waved the movers in. At that moment, the house no longer belonged to the occupants, and the movers took it over. Grabbing dollies, hump straps, and boxes, the men began clearing every room. They worked quickly and without hesitation. There were no children in the house that morning, but there were toys and diapers. The woman who answered the door moved slowly, looking overcome. A sob broke through her blank face when she opened the refrigerator and saw that the movers had cleaned it out, even packing the ice trays. She found her things piled in the back alley. Sheriff John looked to the sky as it began to rain and then looked back at Tim. Quote, "Snowstorm, rainstorm, we don't give a shit," end quote, Tim said, lighting a Salem. No one was home for the next eviction, a 2-story baby blue house. Half the time, the tenants weren't home. Some moved out before the sheriffs arrived. Others didn't realize their day had come. A rarefied bunch called the sheriff's office, asking if their address was on that day's eviction list. But many were unprepared and bewildered when the sheriff came knocking. Some claimed never to have received notice or pointed out, accurately, that the notice did not announce a date or even a range of dates when the eviction would take place. The deputies would shrug. They figured the tenants were just playing the system, staying as long as they could. Dave's assessment was subtler. He thought a kind of collective denial set in among tenants facing eviction, as if they were unable to accept or imagine that one day soon, 2 armed sheriff's deputies would show up, order them out, and usher in a team of movers who would make it look like they had never lived there. Psychologists might agree with him, citing research showing that under conditions of scarcity, people prioritize the now and lose sight of the future, often at great cost. Or they might quote, "How the Other Half Lives," published over a century ago. Quote, "There is nothing in the prospect of a sharp, unceasing battle for the bare necessities of life to encourage looking ahead. Everything to discourage the effort. The evil day of reckoning is put off till a tomorrow that may never come. When it does come, it simply adds another hardship to a life measured from the cradle by such incidents." End quote. Then there were cases that didn't require any sort of psychological sophistication, cases where landlords purposefully conned or misled tenants. Dave told Bronte, the rookie, to climb through a window of the baby blue house and let them in. Inside, they found a Dell computer, a clean leather sofa, and new shoes lining the closets. Someone had left the television on. Dave pointed to the show playing on it and laughed. Quote, "Martha fucking Stewart," end quote. A few minutes later, an older model Jaguar, forest green, pulled into the driveway. 4 young black men hopped out. Quote, "What is going on?" end quote, one asked. Quote, "You've been foreclosed," end quote, John replied, holding up the paper. Quote, "What? We just paid rent this month. Lord have mercy," end quote. One of the men marched straight into the house and quickly emerged cradling a shoebox. He held the box with both arms, the way a running back protects the football when the call is up the middle, then locked it in the Jaguar's trunk. The sheriff deputy stepped away to confer. Quote, these people got screwed, end quote, John told his partner. Quote, the landlord took their rent but didn't pay the mortgage, end quote. Quote, yeah, but John, this is a drug house, end quote, the other deputy replied. John raised his eyebrows, and the sheriff started for the kitchen. Tim was there, assembling boxes. Quote, Tim, this a drug house? End quote, John whispered. Without a word, Tim pulled out a kitchen drawer, as if he had been in the house before. Inside were small Ziploc bags and razor blades. The deputies looked at each other. Sometimes in situations like this, when a landlord foreclosed, Sometimes in situations like this, when a landlord foreclosure caught tenants completely unawares, John would refuse to carry out the judge's order that day, buying tenants more time. But he decided not to stop this one and not to ask to see what was in the shoebox. Narcotics wasn't his beat, and he thought the faultless foreclosure was punishment enough. The next stop was a, quote, junk in, end quote. The one after that was quick. The old black man didn't have much. Quote, man, this makes no sense, end quote, he kept saying as one of the movers dumped the contents of his bedroom dresser into a box. As Dave headed to the van for the next job, he pointed to the man's pile of possessions, now slick with rain, and told John, quote, some people paint on canvases. This is my art, end quote. The pile at the next eviction was even more impressive and included a half-eaten birthday cake and a balloon still perky with helium. And then that brings us to a changing of the passage within this chapter. And this is a longer chapter. Maybe the chapters in the second half might be a little longer than the first half. And so these passages that we just read gives us a very, very real glimpse into the realities of what these evictions are like and how different each one of them are, how the human aspect of them. You know, I think that that passage did a good job of showing how each one of these individuals have a different, unique set of circumstances around these evictions that add to the, it's hard to say unjust, you know, and that's one of the things with, and it's not that I don't think that it's unjust. I do think it's unjust, but that's one of the things with capitalism is that in this system, if you don't pay, you know, you got to pay to play. And so if these people haven't paid their rent, it's hard for me to make the statement that these evictions are unjust, because that's sort of the agreement that you sign up for. But when you see just the sheer amount of these evictions, when you see the way that these people are treated and seen as numbers or case files and not as human beings and not as people and not as families, it does beckon an emotion of unjustness, and to just even the lack of empathy that the people that are carrying out these evictions themselves have, whether it's the movers or the police officers. It's all just going through the motions. There's no humane aspect about it, I guess is what I would lean on. Okay, let's continue reading. Lorraine had grown up with two brothers and two sisters in a squat, yellow brick public housing complex across the street from a baseball field in South Milwaukee. Her mother was an invalid, her body swollen on account of her thyroid. Her father was a window washer. Lorraine remembered him bringing home bags of Ziegler Giant bars when he washed the windows of the candy factory, or armloads of fresh bread when the day schedule took him to certain local restaurants. Lorraine loved her childhood, especially her doting father. Quote, we didn't know we were poor, end quote, she said. Lorraine had struggled in school. In 10th grade, she decided she'd had enough. Quote, everyone around me was making it but me, end quote. She dropped out and began working as a seamstress for $1.50 an hour. She went to work at Everbright, which manufactured corporate signs. During a strike, she left and found work as a machinist at RW Enterprises on Sherman Avenue. Her father constantly worried about his young daughter working with sheet metal and operating punch press machines. Maybe that's why, when a metal disc came down on her hand one day and pinched off the top half of her two middle fingers, all she remembered doing was crying out for her daddy. At 22, Lorraine married a man named Jerry Lee. He asked that she leave RW and stay home, so she did. When Lorraine began studying for the driver's test, Jerry Lee asked her why she needed a license. She put away the manual. They had a daughter 3 years later and another 2 years after that, Megan and Jamie. But soon the marriage began to unwind. It got to the point where Jerry Lee began bringing women back to their home. They divorced after 8 years, and Lorraine began living life as a single mother. Those years were filled with poverty and double shifts and freedom and laughter. If you asked Lorraine, she would tell you they were some of the best years of her life. That's when she began dancing on tables. She liked the money and feeling desired. She would bring the girls to her day job cleaning houses. They'd pitch in, and Lorraine would split her paycheck. One day, Lorraine and the girls went to a 4th of July barbecue. It was 1986. They had been invited because a friend wanted to set Lorraine up with her brother, Glenn. It worked. They fell for each other hard and fast. Glenn was nothing like Jerry Lee. She didn't feel stupid around him. She felt beautiful and useful. Glenn was on parole for robbing a pharmacy. He had done prison time for that job. In fact, he had spent much of his life in and out of prison. Lorraine tried to keep him out of trouble. She would rub his neck after a day of failed job searches. Glenn encouraged Lorraine to get a driver's license, and at 38, she did. Glenn was a romantic and a drinker. He and Lorraine used to get into tumbling arguments. Sometimes, Glenn would come after Lorraine and she'd bloody his face with the phone. Once, their landlord evicted them for causing a racket. The morning after a fight, they would kiss softly and apologize. Theirs was a consuming, brutal kind of love. Lorraine still blamed herself for what happened next. Glenn had come home from his sister's house, drunk and high and roughed up. He had been in a fight and was in one of his darker moods. Glenn could slip into trenches of depression. Sometimes, Lorraine remembered, he even heard voices. Glenn snatched a container of prescription pills, and Lorraine, thinking he might swallow the whole lot, grabbed his arm. They wrestled for the pills, and Glenn slipped against the refrigerator and crashed to the floor. Blood spilled from a head gash. Panicked, Lorraine dialed 911. After the paramedics bandaged his head, the police officers cuffed him. He was sent back to prison for violating his parole by taking narcotics. The last time Lorraine visited Glenn in prison, he didn't look right. He was jumpy and his eyes had a yellowish hue. Uncharacteristically, he asked to cut the visit short because he wasn't feeling well. The next morning, Lorraine's phone rang. She remembered a woman's voice telling her, quote, "There's just no way to say it, but Glenn died," end quote. Overdose. In the ensuing years, Lorraine would come to believe that Glenn had been poisoned by a cellmate. Whatever the case, after 16 years together, Glenn was gone. Lorraine dropped the phone and screamed out his name. Quote, "I died right then and there," end quote, she said. Quote, "My heart fell apart, my body fell apart, my whole being. When he died, it's like my whole life fell into a hole, and I haven't been able to get out ever since," end quote. Okay, that brings us to a changing of the theme within this chapter. So let's have a small reflection. So that was a very sobering passage that we just read. It does a good. Excuse me for stumbling over my words. It articulates very well the traumas that people have experienced that are in these situations. I think that so often we completely discount the traumas that exist when you live in poverty, the traumas that exist when uh, that the traumas that exist because of the perpetuation of capitalism and how it's, I don't know the exact statistics, but over, I think, like the last 20 years, 30 years or something like that, they talk about how many more people have fallen into middle class or lower class and how few people have risen or inside the upper high class, and how much more money the richest people in the world have made in the last 20 years and how little of it the rest of the masses of people have made in that time period. And that was a very bad statistic. That's a very bad way of giving out information. That was very broad and general and not specific enough. But my point in saying that is that there are things that happen to people when they are at the margins of society that perpetuate traumas. And we read in here just, and each time we get the backstory of any of these people's lives and Evicted, it's very similar to the backstory we would get to people's lives when we read High Risers about Cabrini Green. Uh, is what we find out is that these people who are in these situations are already have been born into trauma, have been born into uh, damaging situations, and they're trying to do the best that they can with those damaging situations with that trauma, and it's only compounded by all of the other obstacles that poverty in this society presents to them. And so, and we also in here are seeing the dangers of mass incarceration, this man dying inside of this jail, this man being sent back to jail or prison because of narcotics use instead of him being assisted and helped. And again, so often people who are dealing with addiction are treated as pariahs, are treated as criminals, is treated as a crime issue when all the information and all the data tells you that this is a health issue, that this is not something that can just be, that we can't just generally criminalize uh, drugs or criminalize drug use and think that that is going to make it stop. Uh, and we're getting close to the 30-minute mark, but we're not going to end this episode. We will continue with this episode. We'll probably read one more passage and then end this episode. This is a longer chapter. So let's continue reading. The Eagle moving truck stopped outside a Northside duplex with cream siding. An older child answered the door, a girl, maybe 17 with shorn hair, dark brown skin, and unflinching gray eyes. Dave and the crew hung back, waiting for John to give the okay. The deputies always went first and absorbed attendants' blowback if there was any. Things often got loud. They rarely got violent. Sheriff used different diffusion strategies. John preferred meeting aggression with aggression. Once, he called the sheriff's office in front of a woman in a bathrobe and head wrap, saying into the phone, quote, "If she doesn't shut her mouth and start talking like an adult, I'm going to throw her shit in the street," end quote. The conversation with Gray Eyes was taking longer than usual. Dave watched the white man in a flannel shirt park his truck and approach the door. Landlord, he figured. After a few more minutes, John nodded at Dave, and the crew sprang up. Inside the house, the movers found 5 children. Tim recognized one child as the daughter of a man who used to work on the crew. It wasn't uncommon to evict someone you knew. Most of the movers lived on the north side and had at some point experienced the awkward moment of packing up someone from their church or block. Tim had evicted his own daughter, but this house felt strange. Dave asked what was going on, and John explained that the name on the eviction order belonged to the mother of several of the children. She had died 2 months earlier, and the children had simply gone on living in the house by themselves. As the movers swept through the rooms, Gray Eyes took charge, giving orders to the other children. The youngest was a boy of about 8 or 9. Upstairs, the movers found ratty mattresses on the floor and empty liquor bottles displayed like trophies. In the damp basement, clothes were flung everywhere. The house and the yard were littered with trash. Quote, "Disgusting," end quote, Tim said to the roaches scaling the kitchen wall. As the landlord changed the locks with the power drill and the movers pushed the contents of the house onto the wet curb, the children began to run around and laugh. When the move was done, the crew gathered by the trucks, instinctively stomping the ground to shake loose any stowaway roaches. Those who smoked reached for their packs. They didn't know where the children would go, and they didn't ask. With this job, you saw things. The guy with 10,000 audio cassette tapes of UFO activity who kept yelling, quote, "Everything is in order, everything is in order," end quote. The woman with jars full of urine. The guy who lived in the basement while his pack of chihuahuas overran the house. Just a week earlier, a man had told Sheriff John to give him a minute. Then he shut the door and shot himself in the head. But the squalor was what you got under your skin. Its smells and sights were what you tried to drink away after your shift. Gray Eyes leaned against the porch rail and took long drags of her own cigarette. Lorraine considered asking her brothers and sisters for help. There was her eldest sister, Odessa, who lived a few miles away and spent her days in a nightgown on a Caudry recliner, watching talk shows next to a lampstand crowded with prescription medication containers. She was on SSI and wouldn't be able to help even if she were willing, which she wasn't. Beaker was in worse shape than Odessa. A towering man with loose skin, Beaker was 65 and a heavy smoker who relied on a walker. The family, in the Midwestern way, liked to poke fun at his failing health. Quote, "We've got the funeral home on speed dial," end quote. Even if he wasn't in hospital, Beaker's Social Security stipend was even less than Lorraine's. He could afford the rent, but little else, living hard in a filthy trailer covered in clothes, cigarette boxes and butts, food-encrusted plates, and stray dog shit. Susan was better off. She lived with her husband, Lane, in one of the nicer trailers in the park. The couple were trying desperately to adopt their granddaughter, who had been born, quote, "glowing like a light bulb," end quote, as Lane put it. Their middle daughter, quote, "our heartbreak," end quote, was a heavy cocaine user. And even if that situation wasn't already demanding their resources and attention, Susan didn't trust Lorraine with money. Susan had once gone weeks without speaking to her sister after learning Lorraine had blown a few $100s on a luminous air makeup application kit advertised on television. Then there was Reuben, the blessed child. He was the only one who hadn't inherited their father's Croatian nose, and he didn't live in a trailer park or even a trailer park or even in Cudahy like Odessa. He lived in Oak Creek in his own home, which was big enough to host everyone for Thanksgiving dinner every year. Lorraine could ask Reuben for the rent money, but she wasn't close with her baby brother. Plus, asking for help from better off kin was complicated. Those ties were banked, saved for emergency situations or opportunities to get ahead. People were careful not to overdraw their account because when family members with money grew exhausted by repeated requests, they sometimes withheld support for long periods of time, pegging their relatives' misfortunes to individual failings. This was one reason why family members in the best position to help were often not asked to do so. Lorraine thought her best bet was to approach her younger daughter, Jamie. Lorraine found a ride to Arby's, where Jamie worked. Before she left, she got dressed up, putting on a pale blue shirt, clean dark pants, black low-heeled shoes, and lipstick. Quote, "Can Jamie take our order?" End quote, Lorraine asked another Arby's worker behind the counter. Quote, "Jamie," end quote, the worker called out. Jamie looked up from a pile of dirty dishes, rolled her eyes at her mother, and came walking to the front, her thick auburn curls tucked beneath an Arby's hat. She was not much taller than Lorraine and wore wire glasses and a nun's expression, warm but distant. Staying behind the counter, Jamie whispered, quote, "Mom, you're not supposed to be here," end quote. Quote, "I know," end quote, Lorraine said, dropping her smile to look deeply sad. Quote, "I know, honey, but I just got a 24-hour eviction notice. They are going to throw me out if I don't pay the rent. And, I was wondering if there was any way you could help me," end quote. A line started to form. Jamie stepped away to take orders. Once Jamie had cleared the line, the manager appeared. A rail thin white woman with straw hair and acne. She looked like a high school student. Quote, "Mom, this is my boss," end quote. Jamie sounded embarrassed. Her manager looked to be 10 years her junior. Quote, "Did you come here to visit?" End quote, the manager asked. Quote, "To order," end quote. Quote, "Oh, okay," end quote. The manager put an arm around Jamie. Quote, "I just love your daughter. She is my very favorite worker," end quote. Lorraine ordered and pulled out her wallet to pay, but with a few snappy punches to the register, the manager cleared the charge. Quote, "This one's on me because Jamie is such a wonderful worker," end quote. Quote, "Please don't fire her," end quote, Lorraine replied. The boss cocked her head at Lorraine and skipped off to the drive-thru window. Alone again with Jamie, Lorraine leaned and whispered across the counter, "So, what do you think about," quote, end quote, excuse me, quote, "I can't," end quote, quote, "Okay," end quote, quote, "I can't," end quote. Lorraine looked at the floor. Jamie gathered the apple turnovers. Quote, "I mean, I don't have anything now, but when I get my check, I can have it mailed to you. If you can get someone to help you out till I get paid. But right now, there's nothing I can do. Can you find someone else?" End quote. Quote, "I'll try. I'll pay you back. I promise." end quote. Quote, Mom, I don't want you to pay me back, end quote. Lorraine gathered up her food. Quote, well, okay, end quote, she said, turning to go. Quote, Mom, wait, end quote, Jamie said. Quote, I want to give you a hug, end quote. She came around the counter, hugged her mom, and kissed her on the cheek. Jamie didn't choose to work at Arby's. It was her work release placement. She was in the final months of a 2.5-year sentence. In the evenings, Jamie was transported back to the Women's Correctional Facility on Keefe Avenue. It was her first time in prison for her first arrest, and she had mainly kept her nose in her Bible. She'd had a baby in the toilet and left it there. No one in the family knew why. She was already a mother of a toddler at the time. Jamie had been a bookish child with large round glasses and a mature beyond her years way about her. Now that her prison sentence was coming to an end, Jamie was focused on a single goal: saving enough for an apartment that could accommodate her son, now 6, on overnight visits. The boy was staying with his father. When Jamie went to prison, she gave Lorraine her car and $500 to care for it. But not long after that, Lorraine sold the car and used the $500 to pay a bill. Lorraine had done a similar thing to Megan, her eldest daughter, borrowing money and failing to pay it back. This was the main reason Megan had not spoken to Lorraine in years. Jamie couldn't hold that kind of grudge. In the Arby's parking lot, Lorraine stared out the window. Office Susie had told her to ask her family for rent. She often heard a similar line at the crisis centers. When the social workers behind the glass asked her, quote, well, don't you have family that can help? End quote. Lorraine sometimes would reply, yes, quote, yes, I have family, and no, they can't help, end quote. And that brings us to the changing of the theme in this chapter. So what we're going to do is end this episode here, and then we will return tomorrow to continue reading Evicted by Matthew Desmond. So share this on whatever platform you're listening to it on. Remember, we put these episodes out on a daily basis to provide people the opportunity to begin or further their journey in the struggle against police terrorism, mass incarceration, and racial injustice. So please share this. I just said please share this on whatever platform. All right, I'll let you tomorrow.